Their relationship was so controversial that even the Vatican publicly condemned it. Let's revisit the most iconic and talked about love affair in Hollywood history, the on and off again romance between Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton. Eddie Fisher was about to experience the karma of a lifetime for what he had done to Debbie Reynolds, because just a few years after tying the knot with Elizabeth, he would one day call his house to have Richard Burton answer the phone to let him know that he was sleeping with his wife. There's a lot to unpack here, so let's dive right in. You see, Elizabeth Taylor was coming off the brink of one of Hollywood's biggest scandals. You know, that one scandal where Eddie Fisher left his wife, Debbie Reynolds, to marry Elizabeth Taylor? You see, Eddie and Elizabeth married in 1959, but if you know anything about Elizabeth Taylor, marriage wasn't exactly as permanent to her as it was to most people. Eddie Fisher would get a taste of his own medicine when Elizabeth Taylor would take on the title role of Cleopatra in the 1963 film Cleopatra, where she would star alongside Richard Burton. Now, Elizabeth and Richard had met once before in 1953. They were at a Hollywood party, and Richard recalls saying that Elizabeth was so beautiful that he laughed out loud. And Elizabeth, on the other hand, found Richard to be extremely vulgar. So when Elizabeth found out that Richard Burton was going to be her co-star in Cleopatra, she had no plans on breaking her home with Eddie Fisher to be with Richard. But it seems that the universe had other plans, and Elizabeth ended up finding herself very attracted to a hungover Richard Burton on the first day of filming Cleopatra. And by the time they filmed their first love scene, sparks were flying and everyone on set could notice. Every time they would go to refilm their kissing scene, the kisses would last longer and longer and longer. There was just one problem. Elizabeth was still married to Eddie Fisher, and Richard was still married to his first wife, Sybil. As Elizabeth Taylor's website says, sparks flew and spouses were forgotten. The next day, Richard would move Elizabeth's chair to be next to his, where it would remain for the next 13 years. And they were not hiding this from anyone. Eddie Fisher allegedly stopped coming on set when he saw their chemistry in person, and Richard's wife Sybil was under the impression that this would be like any of his other affairs and he'd be back. But this time was very, very different. Their affair was so steamy that at one point Eddie Fisher called his home. Richard Burton answered the phone and Eddie said, "What are you doing there?" And Richard responded by saying, "What do you think I'm doing? I'm effing your wife." Outside of not hiding it from their spouses or anyone on the movie set, the Italian paparazzi was having a field day with this, and they were being followed everywhere. The paparazzi was very concerned about getting a kissing shot between the two of them, and at one point, the Vatican publicly condemned their relationship, and even had the nerve to charge Elizabeth with erotic vagrancy. Eventually, they would divorce their spouses and marry each other in 1964. Part 2 is coming, and the tumultuous relationship is only beginning.